Welcome to the Ethnicity, Immigration, and Social Policy course. What we have seen is that populations of visible ethnic minorities have steadily increased over the past few decades in immigrant-receptive societies. While a complex calculus of push and pull factors has motivated this increase, one of the main impetus for this migration has been the search for employment, better wages, and a higher standard of living. It is therefore not surprising that the educational attainment of the first generation and beyond have achieved convergence with or exceeded the non-ethnic minority cohort. These outcomes may suggest a greater propensity for ethnic minorities to attain labor market success and to fully integrate within the community. However, the lessons learned from recent studies suggest an uneasiness to boldly claim this as the most convincing conclusion at this juncture. This course engages with this narrative by examining the occupational success of ethnic minorities during the job search, hiring, and promotions process. Moreover, it discusses the interactive role that individuals' non-cognitive skills and social network, a firm's working culture, social trust within a community plays in the integration process. Each lecture in the series will discuss a salient topic of interest to understand ethnicity and immigration, and further engage with the applicable social policy theories and practices using a myriad of global experiences. The term ethnic is a relatively old concept which has taken new significance in the second half of the 20th century. The term derived from the classical Greek word ethnos, referring to pagan or heathen, and was popularized by the New Testament appearing 167 times. In Catholic Europe, the term ethnos was primarily used in this sense from the mid-14th century until the mid-late 19th century, when it gradually began to refer to racial characteristics. In the 20th century, an understanding of ethnicity and ethnic groups has taken divergent paths. At one extreme, particularly nations with a rich communist history, such as Russia, China, and various Eastern European nations, ethnicity has been heavily influenced by a Soviet model which politicized and institutionalized the identification and categorization of ethnic minority groups. A minority nationality was officially characterized by the state following a four commons criteria. A distinct language was one of the criteria. Second criteria was a recognized indigenous homeland and a common territory. The third criteria was a common economic life. And the final and fourth category was a strong sense of identity and distinctive customs ranging from dress, religion, and foods. Now, operationally, this form of a fixed identification essentially narrows the ability of the individual to define themselves outside the boundaries of state-accepted ethnic group categories. As we will see, this is in the case of China in one of our lectures on multiculturalism. At the other extreme, in the classic post-World War II immigrant receptive societies, such as Canada and Australia, ethnics initially evolved into a polite term referring to first-wave immigrants, notably from 1945 to approximately the late 1960s. We see this particularly amongst the Italians, the Portuguese, and Greeks, who were often considered different on cultural grounds relative to the charter groups. In the Canadian context, this might be non-Aboriginal, non-British, or non-French. By the second wave of immigration from the late 1960s to the late 1990s, marked by changes in immigration policies that remove overt favor for family sponsorship and subsequent patterns of chain migration of Western European backgrounds, the visible ethnic minority demographics increased steadily. Today, for instance, in Australia, 9.2% of the nation's population, the majority comprising of Asian ancestries, and 13.4% in the Canadian population, comprising of a mix of Asian, Latin American, and Caribbean ancestries, are considered visible ethnic minorities. They have colloquially taken on the mantle of ethnics. Due partially to a legacy of recent mass migration, both Canada and Australia practices self-identification of ethnicity. Perhaps this is the most accepted normative form of identifying membership into an ethnic group, as it provides the freedom of the individual to define him or herself. Given our nominal repertoire of identities, individuals in this form of identification are able to choose the ethnic group categories that define them. In the next lecture, we will discuss in greater depth the notion of fixed versus self-identification and what it means in terms of ethnic minority boundaries and potential consequences of these boundaries. Ethnic groups and ethnicity have become common words in Anglophone academic literature, although most people using the term ethnicity find definitions unnecessary. The point is, writers often take for granted that the term refers to a set of name groupings singled out by the researcher as ethnic units. Ethnic membership in these groupings is then shown to have an effect or a correlation with one or more dependent variables. In this respect, ethnicity is used as a significant structural phenomena, but this does not really constitute a definition. Similar to the concept of ethnicity, the term ethnic minority carries an intense complexity that is submerged in the distinctions of the majority and minority groups dichotomy. Both ethnic majority and minority members are dependent on the context in which observations are made. Thus, what exactly constitutes an ethnic minority member? It is presumptuous to believe it is a group of people who are numerically inferior to another in a given local context. Does it have undertones of political, economic, and social group inequalities? Is it a group of people who are visibly different from other members of the community? In the most simplistic form, ethnic groups can be viewed in two lights, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first is a primordial occurrence that is unchanging and universal, meaning certain ethnic traits can be ascribed at birth. For instance, white skin pigmentation. The second understanding sees ethnic groups as socially constructed, forged on the basis of a particular history. In other words, ethnic identity is achieved after birth. For example, ethnic groups may be identified by the language spoken, by ancestry, either by place of birth or the ancestors of the individual who formed the group, by religious affiliation, and more broadly by cultural artifacts, for instance, foods, traditions. The majority of ethnic group identities are not based on ascribed traits, but rather on shared values, beliefs, and concerns that are open to acquisition by social conditions. As a consequence, the characteristics that define ethnic groups may vary by context. For example, Vietnamese may be considered an ethnic minority in the United States, yet in another context, say Vietnam, Vietnamese may constitute a combination of several ethnic groups in a Southeast Asian nation. The concept of ethnicity can become so complex that the famed sociologist Max Weber even suggested abandoning it altogether. When Isaja in 1974 examined 65 studies of ethnicity in sociology and anthropology, he found only 13 defined the term. Ironically, it is Weber's definition of ethnic groups that became the standard bearer for generations of sociologists. He posited that an ethnic group constitutes those human groups that entertain a subjective belief in their common descent because of similarities of physical type, or of customs, or of both, or because of memories of colonization or migration. For Weber, ethnicity is seen as a combination of common customs, languages, and values based on a sense of descent extending beyond kinship. He notes, quote, "The persistent effect of the old ways continue as a source of native country sentiment among immigrants, even when they have become so thoroughly adjusted to the new country." In anthropological terms, Frederick Barth defines an ethnic group as a designated population that has four elements. The first is a biologically self-perpetuating population. The second is a shared sort of fundamental cultural values and forms. The third is a field of communication and interaction. And finally, the fourth sort of element is that the group has a membership that identifies itself and is identified by others as constituting a category different from other categories of the same order. Barth's contributions to understanding of ethnic groups provide a criticism to previous usages of ethnicity. He points out that the assumption of ethnic groups possessing only fixed characteristics is a mistake. He states ethnicity as a cultural group is an incorrect mode of thinking. The reasoning here is that a group forged along essential characteristics tend to ignore internal group differences within and across groups. For example, an ethnic minority group may rally around issues of its ethnicity, but this group can differ internally along gender, class, or religious associations. So creating a group along essential characteristics can lack, as it fails to embrace or recognize other multiple groups that every individual is a member of. As such, the process of reaffirming ethnic minority group differences may lead to creating a group category along excessively narrow essentialist characteristics. However, to deny ethnic differences exist is to ignore and perpetuate the reality of ethnic minority group inequalities. Here we see the dilemma of ethnic difference is created. On the one hand, social and economic inequalities exist for many ethnic minority groups and mixed communities. On the other hand, groups constructed on narrow essential characteristics pose a problematic proposition. To get around this dilemma of ethnic difference, Iris Marion Young concentrates on looking at ethnic difference in terms of the relation an ethnic minority group has with the dominant group. Since an ethnic minority group will not be recognized on the basis of its internal group features, questions of essential characteristics are sidestepped. As a consequence, Young has created valid space in which the category ethnic minority group can be used as a basis of analysis, and an examination of group inequalities can occur by simply looking at ethnic minority groups in comparison to the dominant group. In large part, by sidestepping the dilemma of ethnic difference, we can shift the focus of ethnic studies from group characteristics to analyzing social processes. In this mode of thinking, ethnicity is seen as a particular social relationship between agents who consider themselves as being culturally distinctive from members of other groups. Now, Fishman offers a first step in the process of understanding these two components by looking at ethnic groups as being, doing, and knowing. For Fishman, being includes the unconscious acts and behavior that are part of a particular ethnic identity. These may include ties to kinship, ancestry, and the use of language. Doing are overt behaviors and actions, such as cultural or religious activities and traditions, for example, dance, sport, and foods. Knowing is a dimension that preserves ties with the past, the shared history of common descent that Weber makes reference to. Fishman argues that language plays a central role in this knowing process, as well as in the doing phase. The first two dimensions of Fishman's taxonomy deals with characteristics that are observable and measurable. The third dimension, knowing, does not necessarily translate into visible characteristics, although it is still measurable. So really, when we look at ethnicity, we've seen that there's an innumerable amount of theories that has been developed since Weber and Barth, each serving different analytical purposes, including primordialist theory, modernization theory, neo-Marxist, or a class-based approach to ethnicity. This might include class segmentation, split labor market sort of theories, internal colonialism theories, and world systems theories. All these various theories have purport ethnicity to be a potent force under certain conditions. Moreover, all theories ultimately point to different mechanisms and accuse different social actors of using ethnic division to their advantage. In essence, they generally emphasize that ethnicity is constructed and it involves a social sort of and political relation rather than an immutable force. At a more basic level, all the approaches nevertheless argue that ethnicity has something to do with the classification of people and group relationships. They emphasize the sharing of social ties by reference to common origins and a historical past, whether real or perceived, a shared cultural heritage and or language. But then there's a power factor, and this is where it gets muddy. Ethnicity can be seen as a particular social and political relationship between agents who consider themselves as being culturally distinctive from members of other groups. When cultural differences actively make a difference in interactions between members of groups, the social and political relationships have an ethnic element. In other words, ethnicity refers to aspects of both gain and loss in a bargaining social and political interaction. Ethnicity can be seen as one of several outcomes of group interactions in which there's differential power between non-minority and minority groups. An excellent way to conceptualize this idea is to look at the interplay of size and access to power to determine whether ethnic groups are dominant or subordinate. Accordingly, if an ethnic group has both power and size, it is the dominant majority. If it has power but not size, they are the dominant elite. If it has size but it does not have power, it is classified as mass subjects. And finally, if the group has neither size nor power, it is classified as a minority group. It is important to note each of the four types of stratified groups can be multi-ethnic or homogeneous. As such, any of the group types could comprise of several ethnic groups or just one. Through situations of social change and increased mobility, they may start to cross-cut one another so that members of all ethnic groups are found in all strata. In sum, ethnicity can be a useful concept to analyze contact and mutual accommodation between groups, as well as the strategic position of group power within the structure of modern society. This characterization opens the door to discuss the management of ethnic diversity by looking at power relations and the management of social, political, and economic resources among and between dominant and minority groups. Ethnicity can be a malleable concept, even susceptible to an observer's tendency to tribalize. In the Canadian context, the history of dealing with two dominant groups, as well as recent waves of migration for non-traditional European ancestries, have vastly influenced the adoption of ethnic self-identification. Canada is eager to improve its image as a nation in which ethnic differences are valued and appreciated, reinforced by its feigned policies of multiculturalism. Clearly, there's a strong ethnic minority development project in the nation, which suggests that the intention to promote multiculturalism and self-identification of ethnicity may not be entirely altruistic. As hinted earlier, ethnic groups can be viewed in two lights, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The first is a primordial occurrence that's unchanging and universal. The second understanding sees ethnic groups as socially constructed, forged on the basis of a particular history. In Canada, ethnic groups are presently categorized on the basis of self-identification, similar to Australia as we talked about earlier. Effectively, in our national census, the relevant question about ethnicity asks, what ethnic or cultural group do your ancestors belong? The preamble to the question reinforces this idea. And I quote, while most people in Canada view themselves as Canadians, information on their ancestral origins has been collected to capture the changing composition of Canada's diverse population. Therefore, this question refers to the origins of the person's ancestors. Effectively, in the relevant census question in Canada, the response is trying to provide 4 blank boxes for the respondent to complete. Multiple responses are therefore encouraged by the 4 boxes, and explicitly it is stated so to specify as many groups as applicable. The census data on ethnicity is thereafter processed into answers that are classified into categories that correspond to a nation, a subnational area, or religious-oriented groups. The residual category, such as other, is created to sort responses which are non-common. In short, the groups that the respondents selected may not necessarily reflect the respondents themselves, as they may identify themselves differently than their ancestors. This is not a moot point. In effect, the respondents is making assumptions about whether to emphasize nationality over tribal grouping. Will the Ethiopian, for example, assume that the question is about their country of origin, or should they write their identification as a member of a tribal grouping of the nation? In a sort of similar vein, census respondents may have to decide whether to emphasize religion over nationality or give both answers. For example, Sikhs from the Punjab or Jews from Eastern Europe. There is a deep history why Canada provides a space for self-identification of ethnicity. Most Canadians have been touched by the experiences of migration, stretching back as far as the first permanent settlement in New France, modern-day Quebec, in the early 1600s. Whether there were Chinese assisting in the construction of the railroad in the 1880s, Italians or Portuguese filling manual labor positions after World War II, or the new relatively skilled non-European entrants, ethnic groups who migrated to Canada have played a significant role in the development of the nation. In particular, commentators have suggested the evolution of the nation's near obsession with ethnic identification can be traced to its history of managing two dominant groups, the Anglo and Francophone communities. Despite France ceding its territory in Canada to the British, affirmed with the Treaty of Paris in the 18th century, the descendants of French immigrants were able to maintain a distinct identity. Fueled in part by the desire to reduce rebellion and uprisings by the sizable French population, the new British rulers allowed much of the religious, political, and social culture of the French habitants to remain intact. Moreover, since the French population were geographically concentrated, culturally homogeneous, and maintained distinct education, language, and legal institutions, a multicultural compact between the British and the French were relatively successful. Of course, by no means was this multicultural compact without conflict and controversy. Many non-British immigrants who arrived to Canada were regarded by the French as evidence of the English Canada's desire to reduce them to numerical minorities. At the same time, the non-British cohort were viewed with suspicion by English Canadians who were determined to construct a nation within their own image and likeness. Immigrants who came to Canada after Confederation in 1867, who did not possess these attributes, were allowed to enter mainly due to the nation's labor shortage. For example, half of the 15,000 Chinese who immigrated to Canada from 1881 to 1884 were directly employed, and cheaply so, mind you, by the Canadian Pacific Railway to expand Canada's rail networks. By 1903, 73% of Chinese people living in Canada were laborers. Due in part to an increasing Chinese population, their legal rights were quickly reduced, evident by numerous provincial legislations disqualifying their right to the franchise. In modern-day Canada, in order to reduce potential conflicts between the dominant majority French and British descendants, or the founding charter groups, and to provide space for the growing ethnic minority population to celebrate and encourage the diversity, a formal policy of multiculturalism has emerged with the establishment of the multiculturalism documents. That is, the 1971 policy announcement, the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is constitutionally protected, and the 1988 Multiculturalism Act. There are many advantages to the Canadian style of self-identification of ethnicity. Most importantly, it encourages migrants, especially non-European ones, to receive a strong message that they are welcome to the nation. Then to promote multiculturalist tenets of pride in one's ancestry, which is a strong sort of prevailing component in Canadian ideology. Self-identification based on people's ancestries is promoted. In the process, however, there's a risk of confusing ancestry with ethnicity, so that everyone's true ethnic identity is presumed to be rooted as a fixed concrete entity. This point should be tempered by the fact that their membership in an ethnic group is not necessarily permanent. Individuals do have the option to change their answers to the question about ancestry from one census to the next. This is likely to be more common for persons with multiple ancestries. The most important changes will occur, of course, when children move from their parents' home, given the census form is most likely completed by a parent. Also, with increasing intermarriage, young people are more likely to have parents from different ethnic groups and thus may be more inclined to simplify their answer on the question of ancestry by dropping one or more of the ancestral origins. At the end of the day, an ethnic identity is a product of an intertwined network of various ethnocultural narratives. Our expectations and choices are thus made in light to the understanding we have of our ethnocultural stories. Put differently, to understand the ethnic self, one must understand our choices and expectations within our ethnocultural framework. The studies of Vygotsky testifies to this fact. He argues that family and society is crucial to the cognitive development of a child and the adult individual self. In fact, he concludes that the self cannot be realized without the assistance of others. Individuals in our web of communication are responsible for giving the individual experiences with the necessary psychological tools for supporting and creating and sustaining the self. Clearly, understanding the self partially requires understanding our relations to others. Arguably, one's ethnic identity is also grounded in our relationships to a particular national or cultural group. One's socialization within a specific culture dictates the manner in which one perceives the world. One's belief structures, thoughts, values, and morals are shaped within the framework of a particular ethnic culture. The narrative understanding of the construction and reconstruction of our lives is central to understanding how responsibilities are kept coherent and sustainable over substantial stretches of lives that remain our own. To come to grips with our understanding of the self, we must understand the construction and reconstruction of the various narratives that we are exposed to, and the role those in our immediate web of communication and our society at large plays in the process. Our lives are effectively products of an intertwined network of various ethnocultural narratives. A conception of the personal self must be identified at least in part by a history as constituted by patterns of action and response over significant periods of time, and actions themselves as conceived and reconceived in terms of their relation to what precedes and what follows them. The existence of multiple cultural stories immediately spells out that it is quite implausible in many scenarios that there exists an integrated self in the strictest sense. In instances where an individual is subordinated or oppressed, they cannot possess an integrated self. Oppressed individuals form a lack of understanding of their potential choices and expectations. An individual in this environment is incapable of understanding their full cultural stories, and as we will see throughout the lecture series, is also denied the privilege of accessing information that is crucial to reinterpreting their ethnocultural narratives. This concludes our introductory lecture looking at ethnicity, immigration, and social policy. In the following lectures in this series, we'll be looking at ethnic polarization, ethnic wars, multiculturalism. We'll also be looking at various sort of management principles nation states have adopted to engage with ethnic diversity. We'll be looking at European models, Asian and Oceanic models. Well, another sort of salient conceptions we'll be looking at is looking at how immigration plays a strong sort of role when it comes to understanding ethnicity. We'll be looking at ethnic patterns in terms of settlement and human capital, looking at socioeconomic performances. Finally, we'll be looking at concepts of interethnic cooperation and looking ahead in terms of future prospects in the next few years when it comes to ethnic management.